Hey everyone, I'm Mahika, your host for this afternoon, and also a PM here at Figma. Last session of day 2, how crazy is that? Personally, I wish this conference would go on forever. Who is hosting the after party? No. Yeah, Figma, see you there. Okay, we have quite the Figma superstar to close out this room's sessions this afternoon. Sho Kuwamoto, Figma's VP of Product, is here to talk to you today about why we build what we build. So Sho was actually the first person to interview me when I interviewed at Figma around 2 years ago. And now, for those of you who aren't familiar, there is a way to do PM interviews. There's like a structure, there's a framework, there's a method. And so there I am on Zoom with Sho, perched at the edge of my seat, about to answer his question. Only he cuts me off. Skip the PM structure. I don't need it. Just tell me about customer needs. It led to one of the most interesting interviews and honestly conversations I've ever had. Sho is a living embodiment of our users. He lives and breathes their needs. I can think of no one better to share with you Figma's community-driven approach to building. Without further ado, the one and only Sho.
Thanks. Okay. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Yeah, this last couple of days has been amazing for me, like just seeing old friends, meeting new friends. When I found out that we were doing the first in-person config since the first one in 2020, I knew that I had to give a talk. And so this is the talk title that I picked, which is How Figma Connects to Customers as we Hyperscale. And I wanted to talk about customers for 2 reasons. Number one, I think it's one of the most important things that we do is talking to customers. And the second reason I wanted to give a talk about this is because I thought it'd be really easy to do. What I mean by that is this is actually the topic that people ask me the most about, is they'll say things like, well, how do you decide what you're actually going to build? Or how do you prioritize your roadmap? Or why did you decide to do feature Y instead of feature Z? Or like, how did you know that, like when you ship that feature, like yesterday I was saying that I wanted that feature, how did you know that? And so like that's what I actually want to talk about, but that's not an easy thing to talk about because, well, like my background is I started out as an eng leader, and I actually came on board Figma originally to run the engineering team, and I moved into product like not that long ago. I moved into product like 3-4 years ago. And so I had it in my head like, oh, all these people who've been doing product their whole lives, they have these frameworks and they know how to do this stuff, and they have principles, and I don't know that stuff. I just make up stuff, and And so when people ask like, how do you figure this out? Like, I don't know, and it's really hard to commit to a talk about something that you don't know how you do it. So. But I decided I was going to be brave, and so I decided to change the talk from the customer talk to a talk about why we build what we build. And so it's about customers, but it's also about what we do with that information and how we make decisions and so on. And part of why I got brave enough to talk about it this way is, after talking to a lot of people, I realized that when it comes to the easy stuff, there's a way that you can do it. You can say, well, we're going to prioritize by looking at the cost benefit, and we're going to have a list of objectives and strategies, and we're going to align our stuff to the objectives, and we're going to allocate a certain percentage of time to tech debt and whatever. So you can say all that stuff, but then when it comes to the really hard decisions, I think nobody knows how to do it, right? Like people, they try their best to like use their gut. They have conversations they take all the people who know the most about it in the company, they have these conversations, but like nobody knows how to do it, which is why they ask. Like people are asking, hey, how do we do it? Because they don't know. And I don't know and they don't know. So nobody knows, and that's what we're going to talk about. So because it's hard to explain, I thought the best way to do it would be just through stories. So I'm going to tell some stories about some of the things we did, some of the hard trade-offs we had to make, why we went a certain way, et cetera. And I'm going to start the story. Well, first section's about customers. I'm going to start this with a story of the early days of Figma. So when I joined Figma, the website looked like this. And it said, Figma, enter your email, we'll keep you updated. So it was not like a super descriptive website. And so the company was in stealth mode, and they weren't telling anybody what they were doing. And when I joined, the company had already been working for like 2 years on this secret project. And in this day and age, working for 2 years on something without showing people what you're working on is not something you do a lot. And you start getting really worried, and you're like, oh man, like we've been working on this for 2 years, and what if we ship it, and what if nobody likes it, What if nobody even notices that we built this thing, Or what if people think that it's ridiculous what we built? And so they're getting a little nervous. And then the more nervous you get, the more worried you get for shipping. You're like, oh, we've been working on this for 2 years, and it still sucks. You're like, we got to work on it for 3 more months and get it really good, And so there's a lot of tension. And when we finally released it, this is the team. We found that there were some people who really resonated with it, right? Like some people actually hated the idea. People were like, why do you want 7 people working on a document at the same time? That's ridiculous. Or like, I don't want to show my boss my work until I'm ready, which is totally fair, But some people really got the idea, and they wrote back and they're like, oh, this is really cool. I'm trying to use it, but I'm having trouble with this one thing, And as soon as you get somebody who's like you've been working on this thing for 2 years, and you don't even know if anybody's going to care about it, and somebody's like, oh, I like what you're doing, but I'm having this problem. You're like, oh man, I'm going to fix this right now, And you go fix it. And then somebody else says, oh, I can't use it yet because it doesn't do this, but if it does, if you do that, then we'll take a look because I think this is really cool. And then of course you're going to be motivated to do that, So we had this internal private mailing list for the beta, and it was almost like a big chat group of just people who were into Figma, And so it felt like we were all part of the same thing, even though like they were customers and we're building it. And so, of course there's that, but it all felt like we were just a big group. And as we grew, of course, we started getting real customers, and then we actually got a customer support function. So this is Jason. He's our first head of support. And, even after hiring a support team, the team liked continuing to talk to customers and almost like doing support for them, because it was like this vibe of like, hey, it's like this big chat group of like Figma people, And what would happen is, the engineers and the designers, they're not trained customer support people. So like sometimes they would say things and it wasn't like perfect, Like somebody would say things like, hey, like, could you do this? And they'd say, no, it's a bad idea. And you're like, whoa. And Jason would be like, well, could you like, could you say it a little more like this? And then somebody else would say like, hey, like, I wonder if you could do this instead of that. And they'd say, no, that's impossible, and here's why. And they'd go into like a long explanation of why it's impossible. And Jason would be like, like maybe. And so eventually Jason's like, you know what, we're getting to be a real company. We actually have people who are using the product. We have a real support team. Like maybe you should have support handle support. The engineers can do engineering. Like that's why they're called that, And then, we talked about it, but then eventually what we realized was, well, you know what, it's actually really important to have the team talking to customers all the time, because even though the conversations weren't perfect, it was actually really great that the engineers and the designers cared so much that they wanted to, to work with people. And so we just trained the team on what they should do, and sometimes they still got it wrong, but we did that. And we tried to keep that culture going as long as possible. And here's like one story of why that was important. So the guy in the middle, so that's Rasmus obviously, but the guy in the middle, his name is Alec. And he was probably the engineer who spent the most time helping customers out. And he's also like a little bit of an unpredictable guy. And one day I'm walking around, and I'm the eng leader at the time, right? So I'm running the eng team, and I'm walking around, and I'm like, hey, Alec, how's that feature going? And he's like, oh yeah, I'm not working on that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Like, what are you working on, And he said, well, I've been thinking about it, and I just think like, masks are really complicated, and like it gets hard to even tell how your shapes are made and stuff like this. And so I just think we need outline mode. And I'm like, well, okay, that's fine, but that seems really hard. He's like, no, I've been working on it. It's almost done. And so, I'm like, okay, well, let's take a look. And then so we took a look, and it's pretty good. And then we talked about it and like why you might need outline mode versus the feature that he was working on, and so on and so on. And it was really obvious that he knew as much about customers as anybody. And he had a great working first version of it, and we're like, okay, let's just go for it, let's do it. And so like that's why we have outline mode in the tool, is because of Alec. And he thought to do that because he knew what customers needed, right? So we try to keep the spirit alive. Obviously, we don't have random people doing random things all the time, but we do have a culture where we do some of that, right? So twice a year we have this thing called Maker Week, which is like an internal hack week. I've heard a lot of companies, a lot of companies have hack weeks, and they serve different functions in different companies. But for Figma, we actually ship a lot of the stuff that we do at our hack weeks. Like about half the features that we ever have shipped is probably started out as a hack week project. And in addition to that, whenever there's a time where we need to be a little bit more creative about stuff, we'll just be like, let's just stop and let's just do a bunch of stuff and see what comes out. So we like to promote this idea of people experimenting with things, and you can't do that if they don't know what people want, right? Now, as we grew, in addition to this like private email lists, online chat group thing we had going on, eventually like we got bigger, and then we started getting more activity on social networks and forums and things like that. And every time somebody supported us, it just felt like, oh man, like I'm so happy that you're there to support us. And it just felt like that community was just growing, you know what I mean? So this is Diana Mounter, who actually gave a talk yesterday, AKA Broccolini. And she just had this nice tweet about Figma. Here's Jared Arandu talking about our 1.0 release. Here's Meng To. He wrote this article, which is like a comparison of Figma versus Sketch. And then one of my personal favorites, this is Tom Johnson. He wrote this article called "You Are Going to Switch to Figma," which, thank you. And no, but these are like, early supporters who like really believed in what we were doing. And like every time people sort of were, got what we were doing and were excited to support us, I mean, it just made us feel like we wanted to support them, And so this is a list that Benjamin DeCock made in 2016. 2016 was quite early. It was before 1.0, I think. And he made a list of everything he liked, he didn't like about Figma, and he wrote it so clearly, so succinctly. And then each thing on the list I felt like was fair. I was like, yeah, that's true, that's true, that's true, that's true. So we just like worked through this like it was our homework assignment. And some of the things took longer than others. This is a feature that we implemented in 2021, which is that when you have a drop shadow and you have a transparent item, the drop shadow blurs through the transparent item. It looks bad, And he mentioned this in 2016. I finally finished it. I didn't even tag him on this or anything. I just sort of mentioned like, hey, we fixed this. And the same guy, he writes back, he's like, oh my God. And so, it's just nice to feel like these people, I really felt like these people were just helping us by giving us this feedback, helping us to make a better product. And then our community expanded beyond just online. This is, we would go to people's offices, we'd watch them work at their places of work, we'd have them come to our office, we'd have them describe things that they liked, things that they didn't like. And then this is something where we just had a gathering at our office for folks. And we got some screen printing equipment, and people printed shapes on canvas bags and things like that. And so there was this real feeling like we were all part of the same community. Now, obviously, with things like this, if things go well, then the community gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as it gets bigger, it gets hard to keep that same vibe, So these are the different things we do to try to keep it going. So for support, a lot of companies, I think of support as this thing they have to do, and maybe the right thing to do with support is to do it as cheaply as possible, right? Because it's a cost, and if you can cut that cost, then great. But I think for us, maybe because of our history, I don't know, support feels like this important connection to our customers, because like they're the folks that our customers probably connect with the most, like individuals, will talk to support. And I almost feel like it's like the face of the company, especially when people are in trouble and they need help and they're getting support. Like you want to make sure that you're doing a good job. And the support team does a report. This is like what it looks like of what they're learning. And I think every support team does a report, but I think for us, we want to keep it personal. So we try to bring individual stories back. And then we'll also do things like connect people who are having trouble with engineers pretty quickly and so on. And so those are some of the ways we try to keep it a little bit more human. We obviously have a whole team whose job it is to deal with community, and you've probably interacted with these folks over the last couple of days. They're amazing. We've got our design advocates, people who do social, forums. They handle online and in real life community. Our Friends of Figma program, so there's people all around the world in chapters. Apparently there's like 1,000 events, over 1,000 events that they've organized outside the company where people can sort of meet other designers and share tips and things like that. Really, really important parts of our community. Our research, by the way, there's a QR code here. I'm going to step out of the way. So we have a whole research function, obviously. The point of this is if we have a thing where we have a list of people that research can contact if they want to understand people more. And so if you're interested in giving feedback to Figma in a more formal way, just like take a picture of that. You don't have to go to the website now, just take a picture. You can do it later. Okay, and then data science, and then research and data science, they both work together in our company, right? So it's not like quantitative is more important than qualitative, or you do one in isolation of the other. We try to bring quantitative and qualitative together, and then they work with the team. So it's not like they talk to customers instead of us, right? They work with the team, and we all talk to customers together. And then finally, we have voice of the customer database, and there's a person whose entire job it is to make sure that they aggregate all this information into something that we can all understand. And again, we try to bring the human element back into it. So these are just some of the ways in which we try to keep the vibe going, but just the high level though, instead of just focusing on exactly what are the mechanics of how we do all this stuff, just the high level is we really want to keep the team involved with customers as much as possible and as close to the community as possible. Okay, so next I want to talk about this idea of service. And this is, some of the analogies in here are just weird stuff that happens in my own head, but I think the idea of it is something that most people at Figma share. And so when we're small, there was this feeling like, hey, it's just a small group of people, and the customers and the team, we're all just part of this community of people, and we're just trying to make this thing happen. But as you get more people, obviously it gets hard to think of it that way. Like even if you want to, you can't. You end up making some kind of list of needs that you get somehow, right? And you say, well, there's need 1, need 2, need 3. We figured this out through some research, or we talked to people and took votes or whatever. And then, you'll implement some features in order to deal with those needs. This is like a really normal thing you do. And, eventually you start thinking about, well, my job is to make great software, and in order to do that, I need to understand people and their needs. And the issue that I have with thinking about it this way is that you kind of think, if you think about it this way, you're kind of thinking like, my goal is this. My goal is making the software. And then understanding these needs is just this thing I have to do. Like I have a lot of things I have to do. I have to understand people's needs. I have to write them down on a piece of paper, called a PRD, and I've got to put some diagrams in there. I've got to go talk to the engineering team to see if it's possible. I've got to go see if it fits in with our strategy. I have to see if my leaders even agree that this is something I need to do. I got to convince them, and I got to all this stuff, And just as a mentality, if you think my job is to make the software, and understanding user needs is like the thing I have to do, it inevitably just starts to feel like just an obligation, like homework, And we're all super busy, right? We all would love to do an excellent job with everything, but with these obligations, you just end up feeling a little resentful of having to do these obligations, And So there's a trick I use to try to get myself out of that mindset, because I find when I'm in that mindset, I make bad decisions, right? So a trick that I use is, there's this phrase, software as a service, and I think about the word service, and I take that literally as my job is to provide this service. And I think of it almost like I'm running a restaurant, like a super high-end, nice restaurant, okay, like this. And my job is to provide some kind of service to you, right? Like my job is to make sure that you're gonna have the best dinner of your life, you know? And so that's the analogy that I have in my head. And then the analogy for software would be, my job is to just help you do the best design of your life. My job is to help you be a better designer, you know? And it's not that I'm making software and I have to understand your job in order for me to make good software. It's like, my job is to help you be a good designer, and the annoying thing that I have to do, that I wish I didn't have to do, but I'll do anyway, is write the software, you know? Like, if I could help you without writing the software, it's like way easier for me, you know? But I unfortunately have to write the software to help you. And the analogy for the restaurant is kind of like, stuff is gonna happen all the time that you don't expect, but whatever it is, doesn't matter, you're gonna wanna make sure that your customers are having a wonderful evening, right? So I think of it like, my job is this, and this is the thing I have to do in order to do that job. And so, you know, you say, well, why does it matter how you think about it? Well, I think inevitably, whenever you think about something, at least I do, when I think about I want to do something, I'll end up asking myself, well, why do I want to do that thing? And then I'll ask myself, why do I want to do that thing? You know, so these levels of like, you know, you've heard of like 5 whys for other situations. It's sort of like that. When I want to do something, I'll sometimes end up like up-leveling to like, well, what's the goal above that goal? And when I'm in the mind frame of, I want to make a great design tool, and I say, well, ask myself, like, why do I want to make a great design tool? I end up thinking things like, well, that way Figma sells more software, you know, if I make a great design tool. And then if Figma sells more software, then, you know, Figma's a more profitable business. And like, you know, truth be told, I do want that, you know. But that's not why I get up in the morning. That's not like, you know, that's not what drives me, right? And so when I'm in the frame of mind of thinking, well, what I really want to do is I want to help people do great design, and I say, well, why do I care about that? It's like, well, if people can do great design, then they're going to have better results, or their businesses are going to have better results, their companies are going to prosper, they're going to have great careers or whatever. And it's not just that it makes me feel good to think about those things, but I actually think that some of those levels are important for thinking about some of these harder problems about what should I put in the tool, you know? So, for example, we took a long time to develop design token support in Figma, and you know, customers were asking us about it for a while, and I knew that it was important. And one way to think about how do we prioritize that would be sort of a more internally focused mindset. Like you could say, well, how is it impacting revenue? Do we have a retention problem if we don't do this feature? Could a competitor come in? That kind of thing. But I just feel like that's not a helpful way to decide, is that the right time to deliver that feature, right? And instead I was thinking, oh my God, there's all those people out there and they have design teams, and those design teams are using design tokens right now, and they're having to do all this annoying stuff because we haven't supported it yet, you know? Or maybe there's teams that want to move to that methodology and they can't yet, and because of that, they're like, their companies are being impacted, or their careers are maybe, you know, being impacted because they're not using modern methods or whatever, you know? And so for me, it felt like I'm at the restaurant and all the tables are ordering design tokens, and the kitchen isn't pumping out design tokens, and what am I gonna do because they're hungry, you know? And so that customer mindset, I think, is a more helpful framing for thinking about when do you need to prioritize what and why, at least for me. So for me, it's helpful to think about putting customer goals on top. Okay, so now is the part of the conversation where I'm like, the first 2 things I can kind of describe. This is the part that I'm afraid of, because I have these ideas in my head and they are very hard to describe. I'm going to try my best to describe them. Okay, so I kind of feel like when I think about how Figma should be, I think Figma has a shape, and I want the shape of Figma to be good. Okay? Now, another thing I think that relates to this is every time you add a feature to a product, the product gets worse. That's like an idea that I have, okay? Now, this is maybe not everybody's idea. Like a lot of people think, oh, you know, version 1 of the product isn't so good, but we'll just keep implementing features and eventually it'll be good. And I think of it more like, oh man, every time we add a feature to Figma, it's like one more thing for people to learn. And then, you know, each thing you have to put it in the UI somewhere, and then you've got like 5, 10 things competing in the UI for real estate, and especially for these core ideas, this thing has to fit with that thing, has to fit with that thing, and how are we going to get all those things to fit together? And so, I kind of feel like each thing that you add, if you're not careful, you end up with a product that just has all this stuff in it, and it makes it worse, And so, I think about trying to be really careful about making sure that when we put things into Figma that they're in the right place. And my favorite kind of feature to work on is, there was a time when you would just paste something into Figma and it would just go to some random place on the screen, And I was like, well, if we could fix that, it would make people's lives better like 100 times a day. People copy and paste 100 times a day, and it doesn't add anything to Figma. It's not like we're adding a new, feature to Figma. It's just making the thing that's in there better. And so to me, this is like the perfect feature to work on. It's like, man, like if I could have 100 features like this, it'd be great. And the problem with features like this, obviously, is you can't have a conference and say, now announcing, copy and paste is no longer random. I mean, you probably could have back then, and people probably would have been like super excited. But you can only go so far doing those kinds of features. But I do truly think a lot of times people underestimate the impact of fixing things that are broken, And so this is my favorite kind of feature to work on. For the rest of the features that are maybe especially the core features that are at the heart of Figma, I think of it kind of like a puzzle where you have to try to put it together. And this is, again, trying to get at this idea of a product having a shape, is the pieces are on the floor, you're trying to put it together, and ideally it fits together in some like really, really nice, clean, neat package. But it's not easy. You put the first piece in and you put the second piece in and then you think they fit and then you try to put the third one in, it doesn't fit with the other two, so you got to take it out and you put the second one and the third one in and it's looking good, but then you try to put the fourth piece in and that one doesn't fit. So, it's hard to figure out how it all fits. And, one example of this is groups and frames. Early on, we had a debate about whether groups and frames are the same thing or they're different. And they started out different, and eventually we're like, oh man, we should make these the same because they're too similar, And we worked on them for months, and we actually had all these PRs, and the PRs will say things like, add froops to Figma and improve froops. We called them froops, And at the end, it was more confusing with them together than apart, and so we kept them apart. But even now, I kind of feel like maybe we made the wrong call, because people will come up to me and say things like, hey, why do you have groups and frames, And I'll be like, oh, I know, And they'll say, oh, the first thing I do when I teach people Figma is I tell them, never use groups, And then I'm like, why do we have groups, if that's what you're teaching them? So anyway, so that's one that maybe we got wrong. But that's what I mean when I say that it's a puzzle and you have to try to figure out how they fit. And another similar puzzle, which I don't have slides for, but I'll just talk through, is when we did variables, we initially had this idea that variables in design systems were a lot like variables in prototyping, and maybe we could make them the same. And we really, really tried to make them the same. And the team really, really resisted because it's a really big project, and the engineers and the designers who are working on it were like, these are really different, Design tokens are largely immutable. They have giant lists of things that are published to teams, whereas like prototypes usually just have a few variables and they're not published usually, they're like completely different, we should make them different, And then like I listed off all the things that like where they're the same, and the other people went back and forth, and so like half of us were on one side, half of us were on the other side. But like we really, really forced the issue and figured it out, and we decided to try to make them the same, and that's what we delivered. But it's stuff like this. It's like if you don't have those conversations for a product like Figma, then you end up with these really important fundamental parts of Figma having a certain shape, and it's important whether these two things are the same or different, you know what I mean? And so for variables, I'm really proud of how it turned out. It's early days yet, so we'll see, right? But like I think we made the right call with variables. Asset panel. I think I'm gonna have to go a little bit faster, so I might speed up my talking a little bit. But There was a period of time where the assets panel looked like this, and people were like, I'm having trouble finding my components. And a normal way to fix that problem would be to say, hey, well, let's add some better organization to components, or let's add a better search, right? And at the same time that we were looking at this problem, we were also looking at this problem, which is that people wanted their components to be more interactive. So they wanted a hover state, and they wanted a press state, and so on. And instead of thinking of them as separate problems, we were like, maybe these are the same problem. And it was really hard to figure out, but we had a bunch of people together. This is Nico. I see a couple other people in the audience who were here at that time. And we got together for Brady, who was on the design team at the time. I don't know if she's here, but Brady called it the World Peace Summit. And she said, it's because this is a hard problem, but we're going to solve it, like world peace. And we just whiteboarded for like 2 days straight, and eventually we came up with a plan, and there's lots of components to the plan, but one of the components was variants, right? And so variants is a way that you can contain, you have all these buttons that are really similar, and let's just make them all one conceptual thing, and then it also covered like interactions and things like that. And so that's another example of like how we take these core concepts and try to get them into the right shape. Auto layout is another core component of Figma, and when we first launched auto layout, it was pretty new, and it helped people design faster, right? And some people were excited, like this guy. But it was, when I use auto layout, it feels like this a lot to me. I kind of hate it. If it's auto layout that I've set up, usually I love it, and if it's auto layout that somebody else has set up, usually I hate it. And it's not because they're bad at it, it's because I don't understand it. I'll open a file and I'll be like, oh, it's a file and there's stuff in there, and I'll just drag something, and as soon as I drag something, like everything breaks. And so, I mention this just because this is an example of like, it's almost there, but the shape is wrong, It's like the feature is really useful, but it also causes a lot of confusion, and there's just more work to be done. Now, auto layout has a cousin, which is Smart Select. And Smart Select is, you don't have to have auto layout, and you can do auto layout-like things without auto layout. And I like it. I think it's a good feature. But it also feels a little bit undiscoverable. And somehow it feels like that should connect with auto layout more, right? Like maybe I should be able to like just turn this into auto layout when I want and turn it off when I want, or I don't know, something, Like I should be able to have the freedom that this has and the structure that has, but I shouldn't have to think so much, So this is an example of like where it feels like the puzzle isn't quite fitting right. And then finally, so variables, man, for the next 10 years, I'm gonna mess up variables versus variants when I talk. But variables, so we just launched variables, and you can use them for colors like this, obviously. And people have already started asking this on Twitter, and you might already be thinking it, but like we have something called styles, and styles let you reuse the look of something, and we use that for grids and effects and type styles and colors. And variables are a lower level thing, which let you deal with numbers and Booleans and strings and so on. And like colors shows up on both of these lists, So people are like, well, should I use styles for colors or should I use variables for colors? And we have a thing, we have a best practice around it. Styles are probably for more complex things, like if you have multiple layers of colors or if you have a gradient or something like that. And if you just have a single color, you should use variables. But there's something about this that feels like, oh, like this doesn't fit as well as it could, So we're always looking at these features and seeing how they fit and see how we can get the puzzle to fit together a little bit better. Now, color styles has a cousin as well, which is selection colors. And selection colors is the way that you would do style-like things without setting up styles. So it's kind of like the cousin. And the good thing about selection colors is I've never heard anybody complain about selection colors. Like people are like, I love selection colors, Or if they forget to say to tell me they love it, I'll say, oh, what do you think about selection colors? And they'll say, oh, I love selection colors, But Martin developed this one, and he did this during Maker Week. A feature like this, there's lots of stuff under the hood. There's all these like heuristics about when it shows up and what you need to do when this happens and that happens and how it connects to styles and how it connects to colors and all this stuff. But you would never know it because It just feels like, oh, it's just always showing me the thing I want, and I just click the thing, and it always does the thing I want. And so that's what it feels like when it's right, you know? And it's not like the other stuff is not good. I'm not like saying that. Like I'm really proud of the team. I'm really proud of the product. I'm sort of trying to point out this is the kind of thing we think about in terms of like how to make stuff better, you know? So when you're working on a puzzle, usually you have as much time as you want, and you can just sit down and try to make this puzzle good. But in real life, you don't have the kind of time to, you know, just play around with it forever. And you know, the pieces that you're dealing with feel more like this, and they're just like falling from the sky, and you're trying to get the shape right, and then you squeeze it into one place, and it's not great, but then another piece comes in, and you put that in the right place. And eventually, if you get the pieces in just good enough shape, like maybe you'll clear a line, or you'll clear another line, you'll get a little bit more time, and then you could like, you know, more pieces will fall in. And so that's kind of how I think about how all these pieces fit together. And you just can't keep that going unless you keep that shape clean as you go. So the last thing I want to talk about is seeing. And what I mean by this is that it's really hard to see the stuff that's right in front of your face. And that's true for all of us, and it's true for us too. With prototyping, there was this idea that we had at the company, which is that you know, for years, prototyping was like for simple things, and then we kind of slowly crept up and said, okay, you can use it for slightly more complex things, slightly more complex things. But then we had this idea of, well, what if you could just add code to your prototypes, you know? And if you could, then that would mean that anybody, like if you're at a certain level of technical capability, you'd be able to do whatever, and it'd be amazing, you know? And we thought it was a great idea, and like probably just by talking about it, you're probably like, oh, that is a good idea, I wish you'd deliver that, you know? But like, but we really got stuck on it because I think we got excited about the idea of it, you know? We got excited about the idea of like, let's add code to prototypes. And we worked on this for months, and we kept spinning around in circles with like, when would the code be called, and what can you do in the code, and you know, like what's the right way to factor this and that or whatever. And it's like this, it's quite a complex problem. And we just kept spinning around and spinning around on this stuff. And eventually we had to hit the reset button and say, okay, like we're not getting anywhere. What do we do? So we had an intensive couple weeks where we just talked to as many customers as we could about just like, without talking about prototyping with code, we're like, just what do you want to see in prototypes? And what they told us was blindingly obvious. It's like, I'm going to tell you, and you're going to be like, well, of course that's what they told you, you know, because you know. But number one, they said, well, you know, the player crashes a lot. I wish it wouldn't crash so much. You know, runs out of memory, drops frames, unreliable. And so we were like, okay, you're right. And we staffed up a team to, you know, before the player was done by part of the team, and we just made a separate team to just do the player. And so they've already made some improvements. They're going to continue to make improvements. And the second thing they said is, I like prototyping, but it's just too hard. There's just too many noodles. And you know, the most straightforward way to make that better would be to take the existing way to do prototyping and make it a little bit more powerful so you didn't have to do this, you know? And you know, you saw yesterday what we delivered, and so that's the culmination of that. But you know, the insight is I think you can do a lot more with code, and we may eventually do something like that at one point. So you know, but it's just really different, you know, because if you're really going to go down the code path, you start asking questions like, well, why don't I just write code then? Like, why don't I just make a quick code prototype? Like, I'll go in the browser. I know JavaScript. I know CSS. You know, but what you want to use Figma for is you're drawing, and you want to express some interactivity without having to go all the way to code. You just want to add a little bit more, and that's what we should have been doing. In fact, that's an idea that we had early on, you know, and that's part of what made it hard to actually make that decision to stop what we were doing and to go in that different direction. Because like when you start here and then you do all this stuff and you end up like almost where you started. I love this tweet from Dio, by the way. I feel like this is my life. But like, it doesn't feel good to feel like, oh, this thing that we should have done from the beginning, I kind of knew that, and then I forgot, and I got lost, and we did all this stuff. and now here we are back where we started. But you never end up exactly where you started. You end up in a different place due to all the stuff you learned along the way. And you can't sit there and keep going down a path that's maybe not the right path just because of the sunk costs. You have to look at it and say, okay, what do people really want, and make sure you're delivering that. So, the moral of the story here is just, even when you can get confused about things or whatever, but if you can sort of step back and see things clearly, that can really help make sure that you're doing the right thing. And seeing your own product clearly is hard. Okay, so, like I said, this stuff is not, it's not like, there's no recipe, for how we think about this stuff. It's not like there's some process where we take all our inputs and we weight them by this and we put them in a list and then we vote or we do whatever, It's all these things that, like, all the most interesting product decisions that we make are actually like these really hard puzzles that we try to figure out. It all starts from customers and this idea of helping people do design. At least for us, that's what we do. When it comes to why we do this, this idea of helping people do design, right? And the reason why that's, I think, so motivating to everybody here, everybody on our team, everybody at the company, is at the end of the day, I think design is one of the most important things that we do, right? Like, when you wake up in the morning to when you go to bed at night, you exist in the world and you walk around, and 99.99% of every single thing that you see, that you interact with throughout your entire day is something that was designed by somebody for you. You get up in the morning, your bed was designed, and you look over at your nightstand, and the nightstand was designed by somebody, and you go downstairs and you go to your coffee grinder, and that was designed by somebody, and you take a walk, and the sidewalk and the house and the trees were planted there by somebody to create an environment for you. I'm walking my dog, and my dog was probably designed by somebody, kind of, and so the things that we have in the world are a product of design, and the digital world is just as important as the physical world nowadays. I get up in the morning and, I drink my coffee and stuff, but I spend like all day on Slack and Zoom and, email. And, there are people in this room probably who work on Slack and Zoom and Gmail. And, when I have a break, I'll watch Netflix or play Zelda or something. And, it's those things that you work on, that's my life, that's our lives. And when you think about, well, how could this be better? You're thinking about how can we make all this stuff better for everybody, right? And so if we can help you do that, like, that's meaningful to me, And as you go home and you are like, okay, well, how can I make my product better? Like, thinking about that is important, right? Because that's something that impacts all of us. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you with that thought. Hopefully that made some amount of sense. Thank you for coming to this talk. Thank you for coming to Config. It really, 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 really means a lot to us. We say all this stuff about how community is important and how, this is why we do the stuff that we do, but like, it's really true. It's really true. And when you talk to people on the, in the company, hopefully that comes across. So, thank you.